Welcome everyone to a webinar series on the long-term energy scenarios for the clean energy transition. My name is Pablo Carvajal from the IRENA Innovation and Technology Center in Bonn. This webinar series is organized as one of the activities under a clean energy ministerial campaign on the long-term energy scenarios, and it is aimed at promoting the wider adoption and improved use of long-term energy scenarios. The campaign addresses three interrelated themes. The first one is about the use of scenarios in the political process, guiding towards clean energy transition. The second theme is about improving scenarios and modeling tools to reflect emerging factors relevant for the transition. And the third and last theme is approaches to build scenario building capacity in the government sector. Today we have a special joint presentation from Canada. We have Jean-Philippe Bernier from Natural Resources Canada. We have Michael Nadew from the National Energy Board. And we have Nick Macaluso and Robin Wright from Environment and Climate Change Canada. We will have two sections in this webinar session. First, a presentation by Natural Resources Canada and the National Energy Board. And then a second section with a presentation from Environment and Climate Change Canada. Each section will have their own Q&A. Remember that this webinar will be recorded and shared through IRENA's webpage. Before we begin, I will briefly introduce how to operate the Webinar 500 user interface. All of you, the attendees, are currently muted and will remain so throughout the webinar. If you have a question, please send your question to us using the question feature on the webinar panel. Questions can be only reviewed by us and not shared with the audience. We will be monitoring the questions throughout the session and select some to be answered by our panelists at the end of each presentation. Due to time constraints, we apologize in advance if your question is not answered by the end of the session. If you experience any difficulties, please try to reconnect by dialing via phone. You can get the number by clicking on the phone option located on the webinar panel. You may also download the presentation slides in PDF in the handout section. If your technical difficulties remain unresolved, you may write to us through the question section. We will try to help you. So we welcome then our first speakers, Jean-Philippe Bernier, who is a policy analyst in the Renewable and Electrical Energy Division of Natural Resources Canada. As part of the policy team, his responsibilities include contributing to Canada's international engagements on renewables and electricity, with a number of organizations such as SEM, IRENA, IEA, the G7, and G20. Also, Michael Nadew, who is a market analyst with the energy integration team of the National Energy Board for the last 5 years. His work at the NEB is focused on long-term energy modeling, mainly focusing on electricity and renewables. As the lead electricity analyst in his team, he has been part of several publications, including the annual Energy Futures Report, Canada's Renewable Energy Landscape, Energy Dynamics, and several other reports. So, Jean-Philippe, Michael, welcome.
Okay, so hello everyone, and welcome to this webinar. So, as just mentioned, my name is Jean-Philippe Bernier. Our presentation today has several parts. So, well, if you can just switch to the next slide, please. So I will cover the section on Canada's energy context and then pass it over to my colleagues from the National Energy Board and Environment and Climate Change Canada to conclude the presentation. As mentioned earlier, any questions regarding my part of today's presentation will be addressed in the Q&A following the National Energy Board presentation. Next slide, please. So before I let my colleagues tell you about Canada's approach to modeling and the use of scenarios, we thought we would provide you with just a brief overview of Canada's energy sector or climate policies and the jurisdictional context under which those policies are implemented. Canada's been able to leverage its diverse and abundant energy resources, such as renewables, nuclear energy, crude oil, and natural gas, to become a global energy leader. In fact, our energy sector represents a key element of Canada's economy. So that contributes to about 11% of our nominal GDP, 22% of our goods exports in 2017, and represented about $71 billion in capital expenditures in 2017. This makes us one of the largest producers across energy resources. Next slide, please. So Canada has committed to ambitious GHG emission reduction targets, which consist of a 30% reduction below 2005 by 2030, and an 80% reduction by 2050. We begin from a strong position to meet those targets, having about 81% of our electricity coming from non-emitting sources. However, as you can see on the right, fossil fuels still represented over 70% of Canada's secondary energy use in 2015. Next slide, please. So the Canadian government, in collaboration with Canadian provinces and territories, has put forward the PanCanadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change, or the PCF, which is a comprehensive approach to achieve our GHG emission reduction targets. The PCF includes a number of measures. First and foremost is the implementation of a broad-based nationwide price on carbon. The approach for carbon pricing in Canada is flexible to allow provinces to find the system that works best for them, and the price on carbon gradually increasing to reach $50 per ton by 2022. Next slide, please. Jurisdiction over energy in Canada is shared between the federal, provincial, and territorial governments. So federal responsibilities include, but are not limited to, international and interprovincial energy, international power lines, trade and investment, nuclear energy, and uranium. Provincial responsibilities include the regulation of natural resource development within the province, land use and project planning, electricity generation, transmission, and distribution, including electricity prices. So the federal and provincial governments share responsibilities over environmental regulation of new energy projects, research and development, infrastructure, security, and resiliency. Also important to note is the evolving role of Indigenous people and the role they play in energy development, transmission, and use. So with provinces holding a large share of the jurisdiction over energy resource development and use, it's important to note that each of them have their own specific measures to reduce their GHG emissions and transition to a low-carbon economy. So finally, I would note that the shared jurisdiction between the federal and provincial governments adds a layer of complexity to energy policy in Canada and can also increase uncertainty associated with long-term energy planning. Next slide, please. So modeling work at the federal level is often used to inform climate and energy policy development. Although this will not be a subject of discussion today, so provinces are also conducting modeling work of their own. This modeling work informs their own policies, as provinces have significant autonomy in the number of sectors, such as energy, buildings, transportation, industry, and carbon pricing, as mentioned before. In addition, modeling work is performed by Canadian academia, think tank, and private organizations, and serve as a useful complement to the modeling produced by the government. Next slide, please. There are 4 organizations within the federal government that play a role in the collection and analysis of data and the modeling of scenarios of Canada's energy sector. So we have representatives from the National Energy Board and Environment and Climate Change Canada giving a presentation today. So I will just mention Statistics Canada, whose responsibility is to collect the foundational data on which is built most of the modeling and energy data used in the Canadian government. So in the interest of time, I will just quickly go over the role of NRCAN. So NRCAN is an advanced user of energy data and modeling and provides key information, maintains end-use databases, and publishes periodic communications documents. Some of these include the Comprehensive Energy Use Database, which provides an overview of sectoral energy markets in Canada and in each region of the country. This database is maintained by the Office of Energy Efficiency, which is housed in Natural Resources Canada. Another example is the Energy Factbook, which is published annually and provides a quick overview of Canada's energy sector. So I think I will stop right here and pass it over to Michael Nadew from the National Energy Board.
Thank you. So I'll go over the National Energy Board section here. The NEB is a federal regulator established in 1959. We report to Parliament through the Minister of Natural Resources Canada. The NEB has two primary functions, regulatory mandates and energy information program. The focus of this specific presentation is on the work we do on the energy information side.
Next slide, please. Okay, sorry.
So for more than 50 years, the NEB has been producing long-term energy supply and demand projections. We often refer to Energy Futures as our flagship energy information product. Next slide, please. Over the past 4 years, we have released EF on an annual basis. In doing so, we are able to have continuity from our previous work and respond to current issues and topics of interest. Our annual cycle also coincides with building scenarios. In EF 2016, we built scenarios on energy prices, pipelines, and LNG exports. EF 2017 focused on long-term uncertainties regarding climate policy and technology. For that study, we looked at the reference case, which included a base carbon price to capture new policies that were introduced that year. A second scenario that year was the high carbon price case, which explored the impact of having a higher carbon price. A third scenario included emerging technologies. For our latest EF 2018, it builds on the third scenario from EF 2017 by including a deeper version of technology case. So based on our learnings from 2017, so we wanted to include a more robust global context in the case. We aligned key global assumptions to IEA's Sustainable Development Scenario from their World Energy Outlook. We also looked at a broad range of technology options in each sector to model the shifts towards a lower carbon energy system. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. This chart shows the modeling system that creates our energy futures projections, which is a mix of in-house supply and market models, external contracted custom macro projections, and a large energy system model, which is called Energy 2020. It's a hybrid model balancing bottom-up detail with top-down behavioral components. The model has detailed breakdown for all 13 provinces and territories. We have 4 sectors on the demand side: residential, commercial, industrial, transportation, all with detailed subsectors. Electricity production is also defined for utility and industry across various technologies. This model is also used by Environment Canada. Next slide, please. So just to give you an overview of the electricity submodel, historical data is obtained primarily from Statistics Canada. This was mentioned earlier. We use Statistics Canada for their data. Our base capacity expansions are based on data produced by provincial utilities and system operators. The model also includes US data. It's mainly based on EIA's Energy Outlook. In the model, each unit has its own parameters, such as heat rates, capacity factor, and cost information. In long-term scenario analysis, capacity additions are determined by economics, which also considers various constraints. Next slide, please. We are constantly improving our modeling capacity. Over the past few years, we have worked on improving our data quality and collection process. We used our renewable reports to highlight the challenges of data collection and also provide an overview of Canadian renewable landscape. We're building models to address issues such as modeling variable renewables at a higher resolution, and trying to understand the impact on integration, curtailment, and other resources. We also participate in modeling exercises like the Energy Modeling Forum. It provides an excellent opportunity to learn from our international colleagues. So we funnel all these ongoing improvements to complement our product. Next slide, please. We're also building capacity in areas that we have not explored before. So we recently released a short study on the economics of solar power in Canada. It has detailed information for over 20,000 communities in Canada. Next slide, please. So in general, we take a portfolio approach to providing energy information. We publish products to inform Canadians on a variety of energy-related topics. The NEB publishes a variety of reports from a one-page snapshot on a particular topic to interactive profiles on pipelines we regulate, or in-depth analysis for Canadian energy supply and demand projections. We also publish some of our energy supply and demand data and projections through data visualizations, which can be found on our website. Thank you. I think we can open it up for questions.
Thank you very much, Jean-Philippe and Michael. Thank you for your presentations. And yes, we have a couple of questions that we want to ask you. The first one that came, I'm gonna mention two questions, and then either one of you can answer the questions. The first one is, you mentioned scenarios in slides. How are they agreed and discussed among stakeholders? That's the first question. The second question is, you showed ambitious targets of 30% by 2030 and 80% by 2050. How does that contrast with Canada's oil and gas production expansion? That's the two first questions.
So I can answer the scenarios side. and I'll let Jean-Philippe answer the second question.
Okay.
So for our scenarios, we go through a very detailed consultation process. So we provide preliminary assumptions to our stakeholders, and we get their feedback to reflect the feedback we get from them, and that's kind of how we build our scenarios.
This is Nick Macaluso from Environment and Climate Change Canada. When it comes to the kind of the long-term targets and how oil and gas production in Canada kind of interrelates to it, is that, you know, starting off, if you look at the IEA's 450 parts per million study, what they came up with, and some of the other ones, up until 2050, the impact on oil markets of being on that 450 pathway or the 1.5 or the 2 degree is very minimal. And as a result of it is that some of the modeling that we've been doing in support of the Canada's Mid-Century Strategy basically sees that production of oil sands as well as light oil and natural gas production continue to expand in Canada. However, they expand at a slightly lower pace than if they would be if we had no climate change policy. The industry itself is moving forward with a variety of new technological innovations. And as you go into it, from an emissions perspective and a Canada meeting its target, the production issue is not the issue. The issue really becomes is the rest of the world going to be acting, and what's going to be the demand for oil across all nations. And I think it's the demand and the price of that oil that is going to more dictate the pace of the development of Canadian oil and gas industry than any climate change policy, because when it comes to the climate change policy, we do have the technology to become more and more efficient per barrel of output.
Thank you very much for that answer. Talking about policy, we have another question that is related to that. How does the products that the NEB produce, so the Energy Futures documents, I would believe, feed into Parliament? Is there any feedback or iterative process among institutions? How long does it take?
We do, you know, we take feedback from everyone that is involved in using our product. So there's an extensive, you know, consultation process that we go through, and we also go through post-release presentations where we receive feedback from everyone. That's kind of like the general process that we take.
Is it possible for me to add something? I'm calling from the National Energy Board. My name is Abha Bhargava.
Yes, of course, by all means.
So I think, you know, just to add to what Michael said, one of the key outputs of the EF report is actually, or the key outcome is that it is actually used in the policy and decision making very broadly in Canada. I can give you one example. Environment Canada, for example, uses our oil and gas projections, both on the price side and the production side, to feed into their emissions trends report and their projections. So similarly, NRCAN and other government departments, which are direct line departments, use the work that NEB does on energy futures as baseline. So this report is actually one of the only ones, not one of the, but it's the only publicly available report which is comprehensive, and it feeds at various decision-making levels, both on the government side as well as on the private company sides.
Thank you for that answer that complements the ones before. One more question regarding this. We saw that the scenarios, the way you produce the scenarios, are basically driven by, of course, technology and prices. The question is regarding how sensitive are the models regarding oil and gas prices versus technology prices. This is regarding the scenarios that are produced, for example, for the EF 2018, where you can see high price case, low price case. So have you run sensitivity analysis, and what are the insights you can tell us about that?
So we've been doing scenarios for the past few years, and progressively we've been getting better at doing these different scenarios. We're trying to complement, the model that we have with models that can give us more detail. And that's kind of the approach that we've been taking. So if you look at our Energy Futures 2017, that was the first time we tried to do technology-related scenarios. And in EF 2018, we took that even further and added more technology scenarios to complement the work that we did in 2017. So it's a continuing, learning process while we are adding capacity to do these type of scenarios and improving them.
It's Ava Bergava again, and I know that a couple of my colleagues are also on the webinar. Matthew Hansen, he has led the technology work, and Matthew, I wonder if you can add some insights here.
Yeah, I'll just note that in terms of the mix, I'd say the oil and gas prices are super influential on the production side. On the demand, it's mixed just by the nature of Canada, because high prices generally put downward pressure on end-use demand, but also upward pressure on production. So you get sort of a balanced effect. And then in the technology cost side of things, it does make a difference for demand and the electricity supply side of things. In terms of how it actually filters through the model and which is more important, I'd say they're both important, but just in maybe different areas of the energy system.
Thank you for that question. One more question regarding this that just came in. It says, could you explain how you are dealing with the resilience of the planning, maybe regarding to shocks on gas prices or climate change effects?
Sorry, can you repeat that? I didn't get that.
Yes, of course. The question says, could you explain how you are dealing with the resilience of the planning, maybe, for example, related to shocks on gas prices or climate change impacts, for example?
This is Ava Bergava again. If you look up our EF work, we do undertake the high and low oil and gas prices. The EF work is also supplemented by EF supplements, and we have very detailed supplements on the supply side, which are again capturing the impact of low and high gas prices coupled with other climate policies. So I think the best way is to kind of see what the response is to that low price. And again, I don't have the report in front of me, but our website and the stuff that we have there has all the details. And again, with respect to climate change, our reference case, for example, assumes the PanCanadian Framework, and the price of carbon reaches $50 and then stays constant through the forecast period. The technology case, on the other hand, has a carbon tax, which goes up to $140. And so you can actually see some of the impacts flowing from alternate carbon policies in the scenarios that we do.
Thank you very much for that question. And one last question, which seems interesting, and I believe this comes from a Canadian attendee. It says, could you elaborate on how NRCAN and NEB collaborate? For example, does the Energy Future Report feed into any of NRCAN's related work or vice versa? I think this was slightly mentioned before, but maybe you can have a go at it.
You know, sorry, go ahead.
We do work a lot with NRCAN. So Jean-Philippe mentioned that we use their end-use demand data. That is a very extensive data which we fit into our model. We also collaborate on different price parameters and other assumptions. So we do have a close working relationship.
This is Michael Paunescu from Natural Resources Canada. One of the conclusions of this presentation you'll see is about the coordination between federal government departments and agencies. And I would emphasize the fact that we are working closely in getting those scenarios and at the same time in using them in our policy design and implementation. I wouldn't give any particular examples because it's quite obvious in our policy work. We are using environment and climate change Canada scenarios and natural and NEB scenarios in every single way we're doing.
Okay, thank you.
And if yes. I can add, I think from international perspective, I would say that the collaboration that happens between the various groups in Canada is exemplary. We consult, we coordinate, we seek knowledge from each other organizations. For example, currently NEB was asked by the minister to look at the oil transportation, and so NEB is looking at that. We often are called in even from NRCAN just a couple of days ago, to sort of look at the crude by rail transportation, our insights on that. So I mean, that back and forth is an ongoing business for us, and it's a very collaborative model that we have in Canada.
Thank you very much for all of your responses. I think it's time to move on to the second segment of our webinar series with a presentation of Environment and Climate Change Canada. We have two speakers in this second section, Nick Macaluso, who is the Director of the Model Development and Quantitative Research Division, Economic Analysis Directorate within the Strategic Policy Branch of Environment and Climate Change Canada. He has worked on energy, environment, and economic emissions for over 30 years. Nick is responsible for the development, implementation, and use of highly integrated energy emission and economic models that support the Government of Canada's climate policy development. Also, Robin White, who is an economist with the Analysis and Modeling Division of Environment Canada, where he has been involved with producing GHG emission projections with an E3MC model for the last 10 years. Nick, Robin, please.
Well, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be part of this webinar. I'm going to start off with giving a fairly high-level overview of modeling that Environment and Climate Change Canada. For well over a decade, Environment and Climate Change Canada actually has been the lead analytical group for the whole Government of Canada, at least from the policy analysis perspective. We've been strongly supporting the climate change agenda. Prior to that, it was NRCAN that was doing, and they were responsible for developing the official energy emissions and economy forecast that basically underlined all the development of policy when it came to the kind of the issues of climate change, building of climate change plans. Since about 2005, 2007, that function has been transferred over to Environment and Climate Change Canada, and as a result of it, what we've been doing is we've been slowly kind of building up our analytical modeling capacity. And when I get to describing some of the models we'll do, I'll try to highlight some of the work that we're doing. Most of the modeling that we do right now is first and foremost is to establish that official integrated energy emissions economy forecast that virtually all departments kind of use. We interact very closely with the Natural Resources Canada. We have relationships with NEB when it comes to developing our kind of commodity side of our forecast. And we also have strong working relationships with both Agriculture Canada, Finance Canada, as well as some of the other departments. We have the emissions projections that we develop, basically provides the frame for a whole range of analysis that's done by the department, but those range from the development of the projections itself. That's kind of the last one was released this December 2018. We've also do one for the UNFCCC, which is the National Communications Report, as well as some of the other biannual report that we do. That projection frames the analysis when it comes to our regulatory agenda. For example, we're responsible for looking at heavy-duty vehicles, for light-duty vehicles. Even when it comes to the issue of methane regulations, they kind of come to our department, and we're the ones that are doing the analysis of it. When you get to the policy side, Environment Canada's modeling underlies the release of Canada's MidCentury Strategy, which we'll talk to a bit later. And one of the elements there that's kind of not highlighted is the whole climate and carbon pricing agenda that is basically driven out of our kind of department. Because there's no one model that kind of could address the variety of questions that we use, we actually do use a variety of models. And these models are used to try to kind of answer the questions of the day. Next slide, please. Here are some of the models that are being used in Environment Canada. Basically, we start off with E3MC. E3MC is actually a component of two models that was actually developed by Environment Canada back in the early 2000s, and actually is used extensively by the National Energy Board to do their emissions future, and it was actually used by NRCAN when NRCAN was actually developing the Government of Canada's energy and emissions forecast when they were doing that work. Energy 2020 is, as was described by my colleague at the NEB, the version that Environment Canada uses. It has Energy 2020 as its core. The Energy 2020 model is a energy simulation model. It has a very much technological focus. It's actually linked to a macroeconomic model in a dynamic fashion, and it's called the Infometrica model. Infometrica was a firm that was developed in the mid-1970s, and actually their modeling framework has touched virtually every single major Canadian policy when it goes from our pension policy all the way through our energy policy, because it was actually being used back in the early 70s when the first oil crisis came out. That's been the core of the model that we have, and that model there is basically used to do two primary things at Environment Canada. First and foremost, to develop the projection, and secondly, to analyze some of the more targeted type of initiatives. Because when we were developing it, we developed the unit-by-unit electricity model. It's probably one of the models that is best suited to look at issues such as equivalency amongst provinces. And what we mean by that is that if the federal government had the standard for coal fire regulation, we would work with the provinces and look at the individual units to see, could we have a strategy that's kind of deemed to be equivalent. With the prominence of the issues of economy, we started looking at building two computable general equilibrium models. The first one that we built it's called EC Pro. EC Pro is a 10-province, 3-region territorial model. It's multi-sector, multi-regional, and basically we use it to do two things. One, to support the whole carbon pricing agenda. That includes carbon pricing, includes the clean fuel standard, as well as to look at some of the regulatory agenda that actually has a big impact on economies. One of the big features about EC Pro is that it is built on the Statistics Canada supply use tables, so that we have individual snapshots for each of the provinces and territories that we do. It's not like the model, the Informatical model, which was national in scope and then share weighted to the provinces. This one here is actually modeling how citizens in each of our regions are acting. The third model we have, we call it ECMSR. ECMSR is, again, it's a computable general equilibrium model. It is based on the GTAP data set. So we use that model to look at issues such as comparable of effort between Canada and the rest of the world. For example, when we were developing our INDC, we were running that model extensively to see what are the type of policy and what type of targets should Canada get that would be deemed comparable to the efforts of our G7 partners, as well as some of the bigger Annex 1 countries. That the model's database, it runs with the GTAP data set, and it's parameterized to both the U.S. Energy Information Administration's International Energy Outlook, as well as the IEA's International Energy Outlook. The fourth model that we have, it's the Global Change Analysis Model. This is the model that is managed and developed by Battelle. It is an integrated assessment model, and we use that model primarily to look at the issues, deep decarbonization strategies. We used it to develop our mid-century strategy, and we also used it to look at the issues of what does 1.5 and 2 degrees mean for Canada as well as for the rest of the world. Next slide, please. This slide here is a kind of a depiction, as I had sort of mentioned earlier, is that we don't have a unique model that's able to answer all the questions. And in an area where we had to look at our diversity of model sets to basically try to do the analysis that was required and requested by our senior management was the issue of the mid-century strategy. As people may be aware, in November 2016 at COP22, Canada became one of the first 6 countries to actually submit a long-term greenhouse gas development strategy. And while our mid-century strategy is not Canada's blueprint to get to our 2050 target, it actually opened up a conversation in Canada about how you go about achieving Canada's commitment of getting down to 80% below below the 2005 levels by 2050. In doing this analysis, we basically started off with the E3MC, its projections. The projections was then each of the models, GCAM, ECMSR, and EC Pro, was parameterized with the E3MC projection. My team runs an experimental version of the model that we actually are able to forecast out to 2050 and beyond. We actually push it to 2075 in cases. With people that know the GCAM model, they know that it goes up to 2100, and then we have the ECMSR and EC Pro. Using the GCAM model, we started looking at what are the type of policies and technology initiatives that could actually drive Canada to meeting its 2050 target. And it was more of a narrative rather than a model scenario. So basically the narrative that we wanted to have was the electricity sector and hydrogen production moved to extremely clean technology. That was one of the stories that we had. So we modeled that within GCAP. How do you get electricity? How do you get hydrogen? And it being virtually either GHG neutral or having negative greenhouse gas emissions. The next one was when it comes to electricity generation, we wanted to make sure it was carbon free by 2050. And here the issue became, do we have sources of hydro, nuclear, wind, solar? What was the combination of those various technologies, clean technologies, to help make us have a very clean electricity sector? And then we turned to the demand sectors. The focus was we want to have as clean as possible transportation sector. We were able to electrify virtually all passenger transport. However, one of the big challenges that we found was when it came to freight, there was still a contribution of liquids. So the issue then became was how do we make those liquids more clean? And the issue, for example, of biofuels, how do biofuels come in to sort of power our heavy diesel vehicles? Likewise, with space heating, we moved to basically net zero space heating. And then on the fossil fuel sector, we were looking at what are the type of technologies that we would need to do to still continue to produce oil sands and our natural gas, as well as our offshore oil, and still meet our greenhouse gas targets. What we ended up doing was we started off with GCAN. GCAN gave us an emissions and energy profile that met the 150 megatons by 2050. Because GCAN is kind of static in nature when it gets to the issue of the response on the economy, and for us, economy matters, we moved that forecast scenario of energy and emissions mix into the ECMSR model because it's got the greatest connection with GCAN because it's at the Canada level. And from there, we were able to get the macroeconomic response. We had to parameterize the MSR model with innovative technologies to try to mitigate some of the big potential economic impacts. And like most models, it was the clean technologies became like these backstop technologies that we had. And finally, once we had a good portrayal from a CGE model where we had an impact on the economy, labor, wages, we then sort of downscaled it to what does this look like at the provincial level? And by doing that, we ended up getting a fairly robust view of how do we meet our 50%, our 50%, our 80% target by 2050, and the impact across all regions of Canada. Next slide. And at this point, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Robert.
So the next few set of slides are related to our modeling of cleaner technology using our E3MC model, which includes the Energy 2020 model that the NEB is using, how we use that to model our projections. So, I mean, our greenhouse gas projections are sensitive to various different assumptions that we use, and we already model different variations on oil and gas prices and economic growth. The one area that we hadn't up until this past year addressed is analyzing different paths of innovation for technology. And this has become of more interest to us, both because it was coming on the heels of a peer review recommendation, but also because of increased interest of policymakers to meet long-term emission goals. So it's important to understand that the technology case it includes some, but not all possible clean technologies. And we use it to provide an indication of the sensitivity of our projections to faster technological growth than what is in the reference and the additional measures case. The case that we use is generally aligned with the technology assumptions from the NEB's technology case with a few key important differences. We don't assume an increasing carbon price past the 2022 point or any changes in the oil and gas price forecasts beyond what's in the reference case. And we also include credits attributable to our output-based allocations for industry under the federal carbon pricing backstop. Next slide, please. So on this slide, it shows 4 different key technology paths that we had included in our model, and these are largely from the NEB's assumptions. So we have in the upper left-hand corner some changes in sales of new passenger vehicles. In our technology case, we see that it's higher than in our reference case. And other levers in our model that we used, in the lower left-hand corner, you see that we had increased our average SAGD, which stands for steam-assisted gravity drainage. In our oil sands, we increased the average efficiency of the oil sands extraction industry above the reference case. And then on the right-hand side, we have in the top right-hand corner, some in the darker lines, you see more rapid drops in overnight capital costs in key renewable technologies like wind and solar. And in our model, what this has an effect of doing is providing an increased incentive to adopt renewable electric generation. And then in the bottom right-hand corner, we see the increased shares of sales of geothermal and air source heat pumps in the building sector when compared to the reference case. So these assumptions on the slide here were from the NEB's case, and but I mean, one of the challenges that we have is that for other kinds of technologies, we have a challenge in obtaining grounded assumptions on various different potential technology paths. Next slide, please. The way we proceed in developing scenarios in our model, we start off with a base case, and we layer in various different policies that do have an impact on the adoption of cleaner technologies. And this could be represented by moving from the reference case down to a lower emission path in the additional measures case. When we want to add in more aggressive assumptions on technological improvements that occur beyond what happens in a policy environment, then we see the emission path drop lower, as you see in the technology case line there. The modest impacts that we see in 2030 become a lot more apparent as we go farther out into the projection period, and this is a result of the need for our model to turn over capital stocks of poor burning equipment or less efficient technology. So when it adopts cleaner technologies, then we see a larger emission drop there. So again, our technology case does not show the full range of possible clean technologies available to reduce GHGs. It was just a starter case to give an idea of some key clean technologies and what kind of impact it would have on emissions. Next slide, please. So when we're thinking about adding in additional clean technologies in our model, first we need to think about what is causing the main impetus for technological innovation. Is it national level or is it international level? So if it's international level, then we may align to an external source of technological improvement from, for instance, the US EIA. On the national scale, we may think of what our projected forecasts are on increasing certain kinds of technologies that are unique to the Canadian landscape, like SAGD oil sands. So when we have a doubling of implemented technology in SAGD, we may think that by learning by doing that our efficiency will increase substantially. And then once we choose the path that we want for what is influencing our technology, we'll focus on technologies that focus on either sectors with high growth or high stock turnover. And for longer term scenarios, more futuristic technologies like inert anodes and aluminum. We need to think about accounting for the proper accounting of overlapping technological improvements. And then once we model it, this past year we've shared a lot more of it on an open portal so we can have more feedback. And then key gaps that we have in our current level of technology, we look to academics for assistance in helping provide us with additional cost and efficiency forecasts for unmodeled innovations, and even the capacity or capability or approaches to model disruptive technological change. Next slide, please.
Okay, thanks. Michael Paunescu from Natural Resources Canada. I will try to conclude. As I mentioned before, Canada's modeling of long-term energy future is a coordinated and collaborative effort, and the National Energy Board and Environment and Climate Change Canada play a key role. There are a number of challenges. There are challenges in using modeling tools to respond to those very hard energy and climate change policy questions. Also, there are challenges in developing scenarios to incorporate the impact of new emerging technologies, the rapid decline of the cost of renewables, enabling technologies as smart grid and energy storage, and CCUS. And definitely, we are of the view that it's important to continue this work of improving modeling tools to capture all those new developments in technology, policy, consumer behavior, etc. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentation of Environment and Climate Change Canada. We have a couple of questions that we would like to put out as well. First one is the modeling done in-house? How large are the modeling teams to maintain the use and development of the suite of models E3MC, GCAM, EC Pro, ECMS, and R? That's the first question regarding the teams that are working on these models. The second question is, if you could include a sector technology parameter with no effort by tomorrow in the models, what would that be? That's the second question. The third question is, since you are using computable general equilibrium models, could you comment on the macroeconomic impacts on industry and households that come with the deep decarbonization of Canada's energy sector? So those are the three questions. Very interesting indeed.
I guess I'll start off with it, and then my colleague Lee or the in terms of the modeling, all the modeling is done in-house. We have two distinct teams. We have a team that is called the Analysis and Modeling Division that is directed by my colleague Lee, and she has a staff of about 10 to 13 people that kind of look after, and they do all the generation of the projections, basically starting from the beginning, which is going in, getting the StatsCan data, bringing it into the model, putting it into the model, doing the projections, doing the consultations at the provincial level, and then finally its publication. She also uses, with her team, she supports a variety of questions that arise from our various branches in terms of what is the impact of this policy versus the other policy. My shop manages the macroeconomic model that we use to support the Energy 2020 model. It manages the CGE model, the two CGE models in GCAM, and actually we're even playing right now with trying to resurrect a version of the merge model, because we think it's got certain features that might fit very well into supporting government in Canada. My group is a very small group. We have basically 8 people that support it. I could probably use another 5. However, we have an extreme difficulty trying to find the competent people who have knowledge of both the CGE models and the IM models. So that's kind of the first question. Lee, do you have anything to kind of offer there?
No, I think you covered all. Yeah.
The second question, sorry, it's
If you could include a sector.
well, if we could include a sector, well, the question is different for the different models. You know, I could speak to the CGE models, is that if I could introduce a sector to the CGE models, the one that I would want to have in there is really a sector that is the supply sector for the creation of biofuels. When you're using the supply use tables, you have to rely on the economy as it exists, whether it's the international tables in 2011 or 2012, if it's the domestic supply use tables in 2015, and there are sectors in there that are going to be extremely important that are not there right now. So that's the one thing that I would want to do. And more fundamentally, what I would want to do, it's not necessarily adding a sector, it's really going in and trying to have more dynamic and evolving input-output tables so that when you are in 2050, the inputs that go in to produce a widget are going to be very, very different than what's happening today. So what I would love to have is some smart, you know, PhD student to go in and look at how do you create these kind of evolving supply use tables so that by the time we're in 2050 or in 2100, we're able to employ our citizens, we could have strong economic growth, but at the same time have an economy that is very much environmentally friendly. At least that's the two that I would kind of look at from our side. I don't know, Lee, from Energy 2020 side, Robin?
Do you have anything from the tech case?
I mean, I interpreted the question as meaning what sector we would focus on. I mean, it was clear from us that one of the key sectors that had a huge impact was on the policies targeting the oil sands sector because of their substantial growth and also because of the magnitude of some of the energy efficiency improvements that are possible.
On the third question, the macroeconomic impact of
the last question on the CGE side is that while we've ran our models and we've looked at it, we've not really gone in and explored what the economic implications are that are emanating from it. When we were developing our mid-century strategy, these were more of sort of scenarios. We will start looking at the issue of what are the economic implications of any of the decarbonization scenarios once we are starting to ask questions from our ministers in terms of here is the policy approach, what's the economic impact of that policy approach. The way we operate is the fact is that we operate very much as, at least my team operates very much as a consulting group. Until we're asked the question, we don't do the analysis. Right now, when we came to the mid-century strategy, it was more of, we have a story to tell me whether or not Canada could accomplish that story. The issue now becomes, when it comes to the economic effects, is that, you know, what are the technologies you're going to be doing? What is your assumption for the cost of the backstop technologies? There's 1,000,001 questions that need to be resolved before any sort of prudent analyst would try to give a number. So it's something that we're working on, and eventually, once we have a clear path to achieve these targets, we will then kind of convey that message to our senior managers.
Yes, thank you very much for the questions. We're coming to an end, but we don't want to finish before answering 3 more questions that are very interesting from our attendees. The first one is just a quick clarification question regarding the scenarios. Is it carbon-free for the power sector or the entire energy sector, the goals that you have mentioned? That's just a clarification question. Question number 2 is, how do you see the benefits of having multiple government agencies responsible for scenarios and planning as opposed to having just one central agency responsible for these? And the last question, the very last question, could you please elaborate a bit on carbon capture and storage and use technologies being considered in the models, and also on any resulting policy or R&D budgeting impacts that these have had in Canada?
I'll start off with the question in terms of carbon free. What we tried to do when we were developing our mid-century strategy, we tried to go as carbon free or carbon neutral as possible. We were fairly successful for virtually the majority of the sectors, with the exception of a couple. And those were the freight sector, that there would be still some liquid fuels that are going on. Plus two, it was down to 150 megatons. So we had room to do that. So in our modeling, we did try to push it. So it was, the first goal was carbon free for virtually all sectors, because if people do long-term planning, you basically know if you're going to achieve the 1.5 or the 2-degree goal by 2100, whether you're Canada, US, any of the European countries, you're going to have to be net negative by about 2070 to 2080. And with that, I'll try to answer the third question, which is on carbon capture and storage. At least in the GCAN model, we have a variety of carbon capture and storage technologies that are implemented in the model that come in depending on what is the policy forcing scenario that we're doing. Those range from carbon capture at power levels, whether it's natural gas, carbon capture and storage. For Canada, coal is out of the question because of the fact by 2030 to 2040, we're going to have virtually all of our coal plants will be shut down. We do have a lot of BECCS. We have the ability to go BECCS because by the time you get to 2060 to 2070, unless you have some form of BECCS technology in your model is not going to be able to achieve the Paris targets. I'll make one comment about the second question about the benefits of scenarios of multiple departments. Having multiple departments doing scenarios adds a lot of diversity. Not one department has a monopoly over the insights of one area versus another's. We all have our specialties. Ideally, I actually love to see Natural Resources Canada actually enter into the game and start to do scenario analysis like they used to back in the late 80s, early 90s when they were the premier organization. So having one organization isn't the best way to go because it becomes one view. And I think here too, given the challenges that we have from the diversity of energy mixes from across Canada, you need to have multiple views and multiple ideas. Otherwise, having one organization, you could easily have someone turn around and criticize it because it becomes monopolized by the view of one or two particular agencies that tend to provide all the funding. I would hate to become, say it's a private organization funded by the oil and gas industry, I would hate it to become just a spokesman for the oil and gas industry. Likewise, if it was funded all by environmentalists, I would hate for it to be kind of all environmentalists. Diversity is the nature of Canada, and having multiple scenarios is the way to go. Robin, did you have anything?
So in terms of, I'll address the CCS modeling in our E3MC framework. So we have one current operating unit in Canada that we include in our projections, but for the I'm told two units. But in terms of additional CCS coming online in the future, we don't actually see a lot of additional CCS coming online in the absence of a more substantial carbon price, and so we didn't address a CCS possibility in the technology case that we modeled this past round. Although we can do it, but we have that capability, but we just didn't choose to do it.
Okay, I think. Okay, so we've come to an end of the webinar. We want to thank our presenters. Special thanks to the Canadian team. We have had Natural Resources Canada, National Energy Board, and Environment and Climate Change Canada. And in addition to the presenters, they have brought their colleagues into the discussion, which has been brilliant. We would like to remind all the participants that the next session of this webinar will be on the use and improvement of models, and we have Alec Waterhouse from the UK Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, and Reshma Franci from the Ministry of Energy of the United Arab Emirates. This will be on the 21st of February 2019. So keep tuning in, and thank you very much, everybody. Goodbye.